So now it's time for another case study. And for the lecture you just watched, we tried to look at and get an idea and explain we tried to explain why people end up carrying out terrorist attacks, thinking about it from individual level explanations, looking at group explanations of terrorism. But now we want to try to look at a particular case to see if we can dig into these ideas a little bit more. And the case I think that we should look at is that of the individual named Anders Behring Breivik. And some of you may be familiar with Anders Behring Breivik. So before we dig into who he is, what he believes, what drives him, let's look at what he actually did. So Anders Behring Breivik carried out two large-scale terrorist attacks in Oslo, Norway, in 2011. And first, he ended up detonating a bomb outside of the Prime Minister of Norway's office, killing 8 people. And after he had planted that bomb, he immediately left downtown Oslo, drove to the island, the small island called Utøya, in northern area of Norway, where there was a meeting of this group called the Workers' Youth League. So this was a meeting of lots and lots of, even we call kids, would say people under 18 years old, meeting in this political group. And there he ended up traveling out to the island with multiple machine guns and ended up killing 69 kids and injuring over 300 more combined between his mass shooting and the bomb he blew up at the Prime Minister's office. And so this was all carried out in what we thought about in our previous lecture, right? We talked about especially trying to understand whether the motivations for terrorists and why they do what they do is rational, what are perhaps certain psychological factors that are into play. So let's look at some of what the motivations, that at least that Anders Behring Breivik claims that drove him to carrying out his attacks. And he believed he's a far right white supremacist terrorist who really wanted to push back against what he saw as encroaching forces of Islam, feminism, leftist ideology. And these all were some of the political anti-religious motivations that he claims drove him to actually carrying out these particular attacks. And so, again, we ask the question, like, are these decisions rational? And this is a tough thing to assess. He thinks by carrying out his particular attacks, he is able to achieve his particular political objective. It seems planned out. It's very methodical. It's very, very thought out in terms of what he sees as taking up a particular action and achieving a particular result. But there's also real questions about whether there were certain psychological disorders that may have influenced and increased his proclivity for perhaps it being willing to engage in this horrific terrorist attack. And after he was captured carrying out these two attacks, there were two psych evaluations that were carried out of him. The first one claimed that he had paranoid schizophrenia, but there were a lot of questions that were raised about the initial diagnosis, and the second psychological diagnosis argued that he was not actually a paranoid schizophrenic, but he had narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and that these were important driving factors in why he ended up committing these acts. These increased his proclivity to be willing to engage in terrorism. And then there's also further investigation that showed that as a young child, he experienced an extremely psychologically and emotionally abusive mother who treated him absolutely horrifically as a child growing up. There were even incidents where there were social services were called. They weighed the possibility of taking him away from his mother. They ultimately decided against this. But some people have made the argument that this had a certain effect on Anders Behring Breivik. But again, this always comes back to the difficult question that we talked about in our previous lecture of how do we think about the fact that there are many people who experience um, similar horrific childhood as Anders Behring Breivik, or have similar psychological conditions as Anders Behring Breivik, but they don't actually engage in these terrorist attacks. And so it's a really tough thing to ultimately decide and determine why an individual who may or may not have certain psychological conditions, why they're willing to engage in these attacks, and also why the vast majority of people will make rational calculations and determine, even if they have similar political beliefs they have similar political beliefs as Anders Behring Breivik, they don't actually carry out terrorist attacks. And so it really does come down to this difficult question again of how we determine, and the difficulties of trying to parse down and understand even why one particular individual carries out the attacks, then having to scale that up and trying to think about it on a larger scale where people are carrying out terrorist attacks all over the world and trying to come up with explanations. It's extremely difficult to do so. But the idea with these certain explanations, like these psychological explanations, is that perhaps we can be aware that certain psychological conditions, certain ramifications from these individuals' childhood may increase their proclivity. And maybe if we have the capacity to identify those individuals early, perhaps we can work to try and prevent them from becoming the next Anders Behring Breivik. And so Anders Behring Breivik is currently serving a 21-year maximum sentence in prison in Norway. And Norway has you can only get a 21-year maximum sentence, but they do have the capacity to renew your prison term every 5 years, and do so indefinitely if you continue to be deemed a danger to society. And the one difference, though, is that every year after the 21st year, Anders Behring Breivik or any criminal can request parole, but they can be continually denied. So it's likely he will end up serving the rest of his life in a prison in Norway. And even though he has been locked up, he is in prison, he has tried to continue to initiate political movements. He's published a number of manifestos. He's says he's working on a number of books to try to advance his particular beliefs and ideologies. And so in our next class, we'll dig into a little bit more some of the ideologies that have motivated terrorism in the past. But for this, really thought it was important to try to look and get an understanding and look at one particular individual and see how we could try to make a determination of how they could think what they're doing is a rational act, or trying to understand how certain psychological conditions could really play a significant impact on influencing their likelihood of becoming a terrorist. So before we leave, I'll end with our third discussion question for you to work on the boards, and that is, do you think as a society we can ever address all of the factors that lead an individual like Breivik to commit a terrorist act? Again, discussion question 3. Do you think as a society we can ever address all of the factors that lead an individual like Breivik to commit a terrorist act? All right, thanks everybody. I'll talk to you again soon.